in the armory, cleaning it. He continued to pile the dirty straw by the door as Osrith began to sweep the fresh into place. Is that why the Norse and Danes fight to install under-kings? Osrith mused. To strip strength from the Saxon kingdoms so they can't fight back? It is possible, Tagd replied, joining Osrith to smooth out the straw evenly. But they simply want land and wealth. When that goes, so will they. That's why Flansinna's starvation policy will work, in the end. So, concluded Osrith as she thought it through. Will Domhnall be king of Strathclyde also, and therefore be overlord of Halligwithacland? Yes, I expect so, Tagd replied, opening the stable door and forking the fouled straw into a cart. And if Guthord's Halligwithacland then, by implication, Cumbraland and Northumbria. That would be very worrying for those south of Strathclyde and Pitland, Osrith mused. A Gaelish king offering terms. Guthord would be a fool to try do anything other than form an alliance to secure Cumbraland away from a Strathclyde takeover. Dyfnwal is Eochaid's heir, and only a child, so he could not effect an invasion. Domhnall wishes to regain his throne and it would do him no harm to cause Eochaid some strife, especially Eochaid's former slave. Osrith looked back to Tagd, questioningly, hoping for a response. Tagd leaned on the stable fork and loomed at Osrith's face. Guthord would indeed be better allied to Domhnall and support his cause than any alliance with Eochaid. But, he's a king, Osrith. They make decisions themselves and often for no logical reason. Indeed. In the doorway, the tall, pale-haired abbot stood, critically analyzing Tagd's work. Do you find the books suitable for your needs in the scriptorium, Osrith? Isn't it? Yes, your grace. Abbot True curled his lips into a wry smile. Not a bishop, not yet. Abbot will suffice. And yes, it will do the king no harm allying with Albert just so long as the Scots decide to remain north of the wall. And along the two-eyed, Osrith added, picking out the historic boundary just north of Bibbenberg. Abbot True smiled again. You are incredibly well informed, girl. But kings are not infallible. The abbot looked out of the stable door as if King Guthord were approaching. Take the slaver. What of the slaver? Guthord had someone he wronged. It takes a lot for a king to admit an error. Then, he shows humility, Tagd interjected. True's face darkened for a short second as if only just realizing Tagd was there. Then, he added, indeed so. A thought suddenly occurred to Osrith. Abbot True, may you tell me, if you should know, on this slaver, did a woman come ashore? Many did, but, Ethan, was one called Ethan? Abbot True thought for a moment, but then shook his head. The name is not familiar. The slaves have formed a community of their own near Jerham. This often happens to freed slaves. Many change their names in the pursuit of a better life. Abbot True shook his head. It's a terrible thing to do to a person. True leaned his against the frame of the stable. Then why is it done? Osrith asked, silently. To humiliate? To punish? She thought of Finoli. To dispose of people? To minimize costs if they did not give to be paid. The Lord had more money for things which did require wealth. I sought you in the scriptorium, Abbot True said to Osrith. I would speak to you with regard to your research. Then speak, Osrith said. True looked at Tagd with distaste, which was enough for the warrior to put down the fork he was using to gather the straw and stride towards the abbot, closing the stable door behind him. It seems you are finding our documents easy. Your king, Domhnall, conveyed his desire to discover more of our land. Indeed, Osrith nodded. Not just for Domhnall. To that end, I consider it prudent that you have assistance. His brow wrinkled. One of our monks will join you tomorrow. He is learned, and you may ask him anything you wish. After the abbot strode across the courtyard, Tagd returned continuing with the mucking out. He said nothing to Osrith, a strange look on his face. Then, he sunk onto the bottom step of the hayloft. Osrith sat beside him. They make you feel you welcome, but can betray you like that, Tagd said suddenly, addressing the horse trough in a quiet voice. I am Domhnall's man and I always will be. But my father and my brothers were killed in Dund. Hostages stood. He looked across to Osrith, his usual buoyant jeed sagging at the shoulders. Osrith was astonished. She didn't know what to say. Eventually, She placed a hand on his forearm. "You are never angry about it?" "Angry?" Tagd shook his head. "They keep the rest of my family safe." It was like Constantine is, lacking in compassion. He sighed. "When Domhnall asked for my services, it was for his elite guard. Didn't even remember who I was." "Domhnall remembers everyone. It's why he inspires love from his men." Yes, thought Osrith, that was the love she felt. Loyalty, for loyalty was given. Yet, Domhnall was a new Ætildilpin. He had a huge ambition and needed to bend all the resources he had to fulfill it. So did all kings. This king of Cumbraland would be the same. When he eventually came to Caerligwylid. Despite that, Tagd continued, his point being close to Osrith's own thoughts, "It is in my interests to serve Domhnall for life, so this arrangement never stops." Like the slave the abbot spoke about, perpetually bonded to keep half his family safe. What sort of life was that? And Fergus? Tagd turned his head and smiled at Osrith, placing his hand over hers on his arm. "He's a straightforward farmer's son who had a huge battle prowess." "Come on," Tagd added, loosing Osrith's hedge and getting to his feet. "Where are you from? You are no rankless girl. You fight too well." "You are right, I am not. But, don't tell me, you're a queen of Northumbria. But it's safer for you to go around as a servant." Cold dread poured into her stomach. Did Tagd know? Or, was it a coincidental guess? And then he laughed at his own joke. But Tagd she knew returning to her. "Just look after yourself, Osrith. Little warrior, don't get in too deep with them. Have somewhere to go, then go if you need to. You needn't suffer like you did in Ireland for the house Ætildilpin." And then Osrith kissed him on the cheek. There was no heat in it, just gratitude, just happiness that she had a person who cared about her well-being. When she pulled back, Tagd drew her close, looked at her. "Promise me you will watch out for yourself, for they will use you for their ends, Osrith." "As long as you promise to," Osrith whispered to his chest, the thump of his heart close to her ear. Perhaps it was then, Osrith thought, at a future time, when something had changed. Just then, though, a shout broke the spell. Feet thudded across the courtyard, and a shout went up. "Vuz!" Tagd rushed to the door, Osrith catching it and holding it open, hand on buoy. Before them, Fergus was running as members of the household guard rushed past him. "Osrith!" he exclaimed, looking at her. Then Fergus looked across to Tagd. "They need fighters. The Vuz have broken through the outer wall." "It's wood," Osrith said. "They won't be able to get past the stone wall." That was the inner wall. Before that, the Vuz could cause damage. And, as they got beyond the monastery, they were doing it. To be bereaved meant people ... warriors, women, children ... were slaughtered, and already, slaughter was happening as this particularly large force of poorly dressed but well-armed raiders had looted the meager pickings to be had from the villages that, had once, stood between the wooden and stone walls of Caerligwylid. The tribes of Ust had fought for possessions and land since the Latins had been here, who built this place. But this time, the raiders, these Vuz, seemed particularly savage. They almost seemed. "Osrith!" a voice called out of the battle, just in time to avoid an axe blow. She turned, lithely, sliding buoy into the man's stomach. She turned back, charging to where her eye had first been drawn, to a man holding a baby. The mother was screaming at the man, holding the infant by its ankles, before swinging it against the stone of the city wall, bashing out its tiny brain. The child did not even have a chance to cry out. Osrith stopped for a moment as the man, who had taken up yet a second infant, was roaring at the woman, who was being held back by the arms by another delighted river. Then, within a second, she was on him, tackling his legs, before stabbing him in the throat with the short knife given to her by Malmuir. The second baby rolled, unharmed, to the floor as Osrith leapt on the man holding the mother, impaling the blade between his ribs. "Bellegus!" the woman shrieked. Were they the children's names? Osrith wondered, and glanced where the woman was staring, at the grotesque end to one of her twins. Were they her children's names? Or was the woman a heathen, and she was invoking her gods, or grieving to them? With a backwards glance, Osrith dashed on, though the fight was now more of a skirmish and the Vuz were leaving. over the Idunta waiting horses on the northern bank of the river. But they were not at liberty yet. Warriors from the household guard had already crossed the river and were harrying the raiders, several stragglers meeting their end at the and chased towards their horses. "Vaz!" exclaimed one of the citadel's guards, and spat, as many of the rest headed back inside its walls. "Come on," Tagd called, and she looked up to see him striding back towards the city gates. Fergus was further away, and he too was retreating. It was then, just as Osrith was about to step behind the wooden palisade towards the walls, she glanced at the bereaved mother and saw ... who and from where, she could not place, and who was gone within seconds. Osrith saw ... someone she knew. 88,888,888. They spent several cold, crisp days training and eating with the monks as a cold wind blew in from the west. Snow had settled on the broad, high mountains in the south, but it was warmer there. Caligwilid was nestled in a valley protected on three sides by higher ground. Waiting was patience trying, and while they kept up with their sword skill with the palace guards, Tagd and Fergus would spend cold afternoons repairing the monastery, assisting the armorers and generally killing time until the king returned, or there was Osrith in the scriptorium. Osrith had indeed been met by a monk, who introduced himself as Brother Kevin and who showed up the scriptorium tower stairs to a floor above where she had been reading. This room was densely packed with artifacts and from its larger windows had a superb view. The man was young, keen, and seemed to be wearing his tonsure in a horseshoe shape at the back of his head, like the Ional monks. He had sandy-colored hair, was Osrith's height, and a prominent overbite caused his mouth to be constantly in a half-grin. When Brother Given showed her into the room, he smiled, gesturing to the opening in the wall of the tower that effectively acted as a window. "Look," he said in English with a marked Cymric accent. "All Gat can be seen from here. It's marvelous, is it not?" As the young monk pointed out the landmarks, Osrith could see from where they had travelled, from the high land, once now Strathclyde, into the estuary, with the silvery ale of a river snaking through of the low-lying countryside. Looking down, she could see where hovels of the heathen once stood, many areas merely black, charred remains. She wondered where the mother, whose one child she had managed to save, was now. "Over there, that is the kingdom of the Strathclyde Cymric," Brother Given told her in a joyous and hasty tone. Indeed, he had talked non-stop since she strode over the courtyard to the oak door at the bottom of the tower. A little older than Osrith, he had been at the monastery since he was 10, and spoke Latin, English as well as his own native Cymric. "But not Gaelish," he added, the words falling from his mouth as if desperate to escape. "Though they say it's similar to Cymric, not that similar, I find." "And over there," he continued, with no opportunity for Osrith to reply, "if you can see the solid line, that is where the Latins began their wall, which separated them from the land of the Picts." Osrith leaned forward, and could indeed see wall, attributed to the Emperor Hadrian. "You know of the Emperor Hadrian?" Brother Kevin had asked, excitedly, at her words, this time allowing opportunity for Osrith to answer. "From Dunnotter's manuscripts," Osrith allowed, and at that moment, as the orange evening sun darkened to a red, she suddenly missed her time. The fortress, where she was just merely a kitchen servant trying to avoid Constantine, where she slept in the back kitchen alcove, an underground stream keeping her company as it quietly tinkled over pebbles. Was her silver still there, so bright silver, stolen, no doubt, which she had discovered when she fled from the sea gate from Bibbenberg? She had moved the granite block and buried it beneath the stream. No, it would he long gone by now. Osrith's silence, with her own thoughts in her mind, had not seemed to have deterred the young monk, who was busily picking out the landscape features, irrespective of her contribution. And just there, he pointed out, "Can you see the square?" Osrith squinted in the evening light and leaned towards the window. "That is the first fortress the Latins built from here to the east coast, Oswald's bird fort, it's called, for St. Oswald stayed there, after he had collected men from Rush to fight Cadwallon and reclaim his father's throne." Oswald? But of course, her ancestor had, as she had, spent time in Ulster with the Dalriatans. Yes, the blessed king of the Bernicians and Dirians, of course, made a surprise attack on Cadwallon, completely destroyed his army, though, of course, Cadwallon had done the same to Northumbria, and killed Edwin, and Eadfrith too. He paused, looking at Osrith's face. But, of course, you knew this, being English, he said, conceding the point. I do apologize, I rarely have many people to speak to. He gestured towards the shelves with rolls of parchment. Papers seemed to be bundled up in amongst volumes of books, and as Brother Given showed her, pointing to, a copy of the Irish Annals, and, a transcript of the Lindisfarne Gospels, Osrith marvelled at the lack of sequence to them all. Oh, I can help you find anything you're looking for, Kevin exclaimed, when Osrith pointed that out. I do take a deal of interest in the history of our lands. What do you need? I am looking for Pitland, Osrith said, vaguely. The truth was she had come to spy, not to research for Culdies, as Greogair had put to the abbot True, and too, and Bernicia. She looked at the young man's honest, eager face. The things you are interested in, I suppose. Great, Kevin replied, a big grin on his face. We can start in the morning, with Pitland. 88,888,888. And, concluded Kevin, pointing out the words to Osrith, that nobility honoured their promise to supply men to Oswald when he came, and they formalized Rmoth's betrothal to Oswy, Oswald's younger brother. But you knew this, Kevin added, a little crestfallen. They had spent much of the day going through manuscripts, starting early in the morning when the young monk had called up to her in the hail. Oft on his way back from matins in the monastery hall and barely avoided a brick being hurled down from the monastery window by a grumpy and now very much awake Fergus. Osrith had followed Given up the stairs to the manuscripts, the chill of the morning making her shiver, and she hoped the sun would be out and the room would warm, if they were to be there all day. She decided on the strategy of opportunity, letting the young monk show her what he thought she wanted to know. Anything that sounded unusual or contradictory she could remember to tell Domhnall. But, by the time afternoon prayers had made and cautious Given say, come across to the door, tomorrow morning, won't you? And dismiss himself in a hurry, Osrith was feeling that the history of Pitland, Northumbria, Gododine, and even Dalriata, Irian, East Anglia, Kent and Wessex was one that was very intertangled. She needed to be specific. But how? As the afternoon wore on, and the end of prayer bells rang, Osrith made her way to the kitchens, hungry and in need of a drink. The cook, a huge man who spoke only Cymric, ignored Osrith as she found spring water at the back of the kitchen, and she scooped cool, chilled water into her mouth. You're one of the warriors from Alba, he said, suddenly, noticing her. From his tone, Osrith felt her right hand go to buoy. You are expected in the hall. All warriors eat in the hall, he added. He followed her gaze, which took in fish and meat, bread and fruit, and laughed heartily. You like the look of it? Osrith nodded. Half, he called. A young girl, about Osrith's age, appeared at the door. Put on a platter anything this young man desires. And for pity's sake, show him the hall. The last warrior boy we had in here fell into the spring and drowned. He saw Osrith's doubtful expression. It's deceiving ... very deep ... takes you all the way down to our Orne. It do. And you'll soon be feasting with Belenligus. Instead of the rivers, Osrith said, as she followed half across the courtyard, the girl balancing the platter on one hand. She was a pretty girl, her fair, golden hair picked out in the failing light. But the cook had mentioned the two gods of the heathen she did know, and the image of the woman with one dead, one live twin in her arms was still in the recesses of her mind. They do come, half admitted, as Osrith opened the door of the monastery's hall. But we are safe in here. Our warriors raid their villages too. They came last week, and I fought, though Osrith half-examined Osrith's features. It's how it is, she shrugged. Your father mentioned the gods ... not God ... and I've heard them before. Oh, yes, half said, quietly, leaning her head close to Osrith's. We are Christians, But we remember our gods too. Most of the working servants are the same. She looked around the hall. Before the Latins built this city, it was called Lugubalia, after the warrior god of the sun. When it sets in the west, Lug is sending out all his battle strength for the morning. Not knowing what else to do, Osrith nodded. Are you a heathen? Half continued. You have been visited by a god, I can tell. My mother had the gift I have. Do you know the Morrigan? Half nodded, eyes widened. I made a kind of promise to her, Osrath continued, not looking round to see if Tagged was in the hall, though I didn't know I had. She came to me, reminding me of it. Half still stared at her, open-mouthed. What? Osrith asked, as the girl goggled at her. Osrith looked back at her, waiting. The Morrigan warns of death, Half said, eventually, her eyes still wide with wonder. Terror? Osrith did not know. Come to me, to the kitchen when Atildragiola begins and the Christians begin to fast for Advent. You need to eat every day. And the girl looked so earnest that Osrith nodded. A shout went up from a table board just behind her. Osrith turned, but the table of warriors were not Tagged or Fergus. They were warriors whom Osrith had never seen before. One of them shouted over to Half in a dialect of Cymric that Osrith didn't quite understand. I must go, Half said, gesturing to the plate the cook had prepared for her. Osrith sat down, withdrawing the small knife. It still had blood on it, and she wiped it hastily on her breeches. Half put her hand out to Osrith's wrist. Come back, anytime, to the kitchen, my father will feed you, she said to Osrith, ignoring the shouts and whistles from the unknown warriors at the further table. Their warriors? The king's men. That was right, thought Osrith. Kevin had told her that families of Urian's line, men of Risht, still lived here and formed the military. They had been the ones who had torn past her when the Riz attacked. It would only be later she would search the men's faces from the image in her mind. There were the warriors of Risht, she realized, later. They must be kin of her mother. But now they are King Guthred's men. Some are Danes. And the king is. Half removed her hand, guiltily, as a tall, broad warrior trod towards them. Half looked apprehensive. Osrith tried to work out why, as a face not dissimilar to Gert, the honest-faced Frisian fisherman who had come to Dunnottar, came close to them. In the Othwick. Half inhaled sharply, gripping Osrith's hand again. Osrith took it instinctively, looking now as more warriors ranged over the tables. And, next to them, were Fergus and Tagged. The Danish warrior frowned at Osrith, hand closing around the hilt of her sword. Stop chatting up the servants, Osrith, Tagged called, beckoning her over. Half dropped Osrith's hand hurriedly and Osrith got up and strode over to them, grinning. The Danish warrior stepped towards Half now and Osrith saw the girl scuttle off, her face flushed red. Where were you today? Tagged asked, eyeing her plate of food, which was much fuller than either of theirs. Osrith offered it to him and Fergus. There was far too much for her to eat by herself. Fergus needed no second invitation. AMD speared a piece of meat onto his knife. In the scriptorium, she replied, doing as Domhnall asked. With that idiot who woke us up before cockcrow, scorned Fergus. I thought you would train today, Tagged went on, his voice almost plaintive. He too speared some meat from Osrith's plate. I saw you, Osrith conceded. I was going to. She had. When Kevin went off to afternoon prayers, she had looked down into the courtyard and saw all the warriors draining, Fergus's orange-red hair, Tagged's pale head, the whiteness of his hair enhanced by the coldness of the day. And, she had to confess, she did more than look at Tagged, she looked over his body, long and gainly, muscular and swift, sinewy and lithe. It had been his body she was noticing more these days, since she had kissed his cheek and he had held her body. As he moved, as he talked, as he sang, as he slept. Though they were hand-wed, they were not really married. She was his comrade, nothing more. And Osrith was beginning to yearn that it was more. When Kevin had gone to prayers that morning, knowing he would be at least an hour, Osrith had looked at Tagged for a while, training with the king's guards, her pulse increasing, before suddenly backing into the corner of the manuscript room, hands down her leather trousers to find her bump, enfolded in her flesh. As Osrith had grown older, the minuscule bump was more responsive to her touch, and she had ground it with her fingers as she had done when she had, with much rewarded effort, borne down as she rode Constantine at Dund, discovering with the prince that night that both humping and pleasure were integrally connected. It was already a well-practiced action and made Osrith feel relaxed when she came, worries fading to nothing as the waves of pleasure overcame her. The first time Osrith had found out about it was when she had been at Bibbenberg. Osrith had seen an older boy warrior from her uncle's guard, kneeling with the rest of the guard in the fortress's chapel, blessing them for their next attack. In her prepubescent waking dreams Osrith thought of him and, as she watched him practice with his sword, she had found a corner of the chapel's attic to huddle. Her skirts had tangled between her legs and she had found a pleasure and had then spent the rest of that afternoon writhing and rubbing with her clothes, experimenting, the boy's face in her mind as her body got worked up. And the boy, whose name she didn't know, never did come back. Subsequent days had followed with her new discovery, many happy hours spent refining the technique, finding the best resulted from pulling the cloth up and further up between her lips until the fabric could go no further, and crossing her legs around it, bearing down, then moving her folded legs up and down so the material frictioned her flesh, pulling it around to get the right pressure until she found a satisfying rhythm. Or, as had been the faster technique, placing her feet flat on the floor, knees bent, and using the thumb knuckle of her hand to push upwards, then round in circles, occasionally accelerating the process by screwing her tiny, underdeveloped knobs on her chest with her fingers to hasten her to the end, pulling them, pinching them, scratching and flicking with her nails. At Bibbenberg, she had not really known what she was doing, only that it felt good as she thought of him, fair-haired, blue-eyed warrior. Not unlike the warrior beside her now, eating the apple pieces that she'd ignored. Osrith knew how to she could come quickly, and had done so that morning, her long fingers opening her damp folds, twisting them slowly, then quickly, around the collection of sensitive nerve endings, as her other grasped the window ledge until, in Osrith's mind, it was Tagd's hand getting her off. Gregor says we are to be here longer than they thought, Tagd went on, interrupting her memory, and a flush spread over Osrith's neck. Osrith replied, as she recalled that exquisite release of tension that he had invoked in her body, knowing nothing could ever be for them. When had she begun to desire him? At Dunotter, where she had stayed, hidden, to watch him slide his hand up and down his cock, much larger and seemingly easier to entice to spill forth its seed, watching until he came, having chanced on him one night while looking for Domhnall at Tara, when he was pushing his suit to Gormlith and had found a servant of the Ullaid instead. No, Osrith cautioned herself, sharply. They were warriors, together only for fighting. Yet, another, quieter, voice told Osrith, what was drawing her to him. Was it, indeed, the Morrigan? So we must train with the king's men, Tagd added, turning, as Osrith had turned, to look at the warriors. If ever we get to understand them. You can help, Fergus added, looking up from his food. Osrith, because she had turned to look at anything rather than Tagd's face just now. She nodded to Fergus, but then swung back as another face appeared, hooded as all the brothers were. The one she knew. Did you see? Osrith began, as the rest of the brothers walked slowly into the hall. The brother turned again, but was gone. What? Tagd asked. Fergus shrugged. I thought I saw. She looked at Tagd, doubt's overwhelming memory. Nothing. So, about the king's guard. She took up more meat from her plate, suddenly feeling hungry. They're Danes. Some of them, Fergus replied. Cumbrail and Cymry, Angles, Saxons, Britons. All keeping their swords sharp by practicing against the Strathclyde. Why? King Eochaid, of course. Domhnall's enemy. King Guthred's enemy. Eochaid, the Dane who had glowered at her when Half had been standing next to her, leaned over from his table. I don't speak Danish, Osrith said, in English, then added, Cymric. Who are you? The Dane asked, in English. One of King Domhnall's warriors, she corrected. And why are you here? We are to task the king, King Guthred, with an alliance against Eochaid, and dash. No, boomed the Dane, here. And quickly, he drew his sword, holding it to her throat. Or, at least where Osrith's throat would have been had she not whipped back from the bench, withdrawing Buoy. A low murmur was growing around them. Beside her, Tagged and Fergus had their swords out too. I do not know what you, began Osrith, whipping back as the Dane took a lunge at her, sword slamming, blade first, onto the table, making her plate bounce and the ale jugs skittered to the floor. Beside them, the king's guards began to rise, gathering round the Dane. What has he done, Galma? Taken my woman? The Danes snarled, lunging at Osrith again. Behind him, the guard had unsheathed their swords. Osrith held tight to Buoy. What does he mean, Osrith? Tagged asked. No idea, she shouted back, as this time Galma's blade buried itself into the oak. When he couldn't pull it free, he roared, fixing Osrith with a glare. My woman. Behind them, a girl screamed, and Osrith saw water running onto the floor as she looked on in horror. She like you? He accused, leaping over the table. Osrith stopped still, trying to raise Buoy, but she had little room to wield it. Ducking just in time, Osrith just missed being jabbed in the eye. And I like her, Osrith shot back, diving out of the way. Is toil my, she translated, for Tagged and Fergus's benefit. I don't think that's what he's trying to say, Osrith, Tagged replied over the clash of steel behind her, his blade blocking a certainly lethal blow to her back. And then, suddenly, a voice rang out behind the royal guard. Get back, d'ye hear? She is under the protection of King Guthard.